I'm much more interested in what everybody has to say about this work since you've read it in advance. So I'm going to try to limit my own remarks to hopefully no more than 15 minutes. Now, some of you may remember the public controversies of the 1990s, which emerged at the intersection of HIV/AIDS and complications in circumcision schools, and how traditional leaders, particularly from the Eastern Cape, initially argued that the involvement of the state through regulation and biomedical interventions in that space were trespassing on the jurisdiction of the chiefs, who were the sole legitimate custodians of Xhosa tradition. So this notion of Xhosa tradition is not new in this paper. And those conversations, which I see as having been about the shape of modernity in post-apartheid South Africa, form a silent background to this paper. I'm not addressing them directly here. The paper itself is concerned about the relationship between tradition and the maturing African nationalism around the middle of the 20th century. I used Nelson Mandela's well-documented references to his initiation in order to distinguish his more positive embrace of tradition from the ambivalence of a petty bourgeoisie in the early part of the 20th century. And while, of course, Nelson Mandela's own relationship to tradition could be said to be equally ambivalent, I argue that in his case, the ambivalence had nothing to do with the new kind of religious commitments of that petty bourgeoisie, and had a lot to do with the simultaneous commitment to a sense of tradition and African nationalism on the one hand, a seeming contradiction, if you will. And that means perhaps that the best way to think about it is to compare him not with the petty bourgeoisie as much as with the generation of African nationalists that come of political age in the 1940s, and for whom all customary practices were viewed more or less negatively. I then sort of list a number of Mandela's contemporary comrades from the Eastern Cape, from Alfred Uma, Govan Begi, Oliver Tambo, Raymond Mhlaba, Robert Sobukwe, Walter Sisulu, all of whom either did not mention their own initiations or were actively against the invocations of ethnic identities in their work. I make 2 points about why African nationalists would not reify Xhosa tradition into a collective emblem of identity. The first point being simply that it could not measure up to the demands of their present epoch, as Nelson Mandela puts it clearly. And the second point, which is more important, is that a pre-colonial Xhosa tradition was problematic in the first place because the colonial encounter itself had facilitated the generation or the emergence of new neo-traditions that were attached to institutions such as the church, such as school, and chieftaincy itself, which, as we know, had become part of the administrative machinery of separate development in South Africa. These neo-traditions, in turn, sort of tweaked existing ethnic identities and reinforced them. While on the other hand, they also generated translocal supra-tribal forms of consciousness that became seedbeds for the emerging nationalism in South Africa. So we may conclude, therefore, from all of this, that there was this a kind of a radical discontinuity between nationalism and Xhosa tradition or tradition in general. And I sort of argue that a close reading of Nelson Mandela, however, raises questions that sort of problematize this sort of neat discontinuity between the two discourses. In his later life, Nelson Mandela came to embrace elements of tradition, arguing that he respected customs and tradition. And his many references to his initiation clearly demonstrate that he was far less alienated, if you will, from his customs and tradition than would be the case for the other comrades of his. And I make 3 points about that, upon reading, a close reading of the autobiography, sort of one gleans up 3 points. The first is that Nelson Mandela saw in tradition what he calls seeds of revolutionary democracy. His interest in communism was to a large extent informed by his reading of classless society as resonating with pre-colonial African socialities. So he saw in tradition this kind of seeds of revolutionary democracy. Secondly, holding to a sense of tradition for Nelson Mandela meant keeping alive memories of previous struggles and what Adorno calls accumulated sufferings, the things that could not be repeated, in other words. And again, one is conscious here of the fact that Nelson Mandela portrays himself as a forward-looking leader committed to reconciliation through forgiveness. But Mandela, the nationalist, also tended to quote 19th century struggles, anti-colonial wars, etc. And this sort of, there's always a contradiction in Nelson Mandela that some of his biographers have remarked on as well. The third point is that he derived pleasure in it. He really just enjoyed talking about his initiation and a respect for tradition. And I see this as, on the one hand, a kind of nostalgia for his high-born sort of country boy background. But on the other hand, as a kind of a jab, a middle finger, if you will, to the niceties of modernity, of white modernity as well. So there is therefore this unresolvable contradiction in which Nelson Mandela, like his comrades, denounced and distanced himself from the parochialism of tradition, while on the other hand, he held on to a strategic usefulness of tradition. And if you look again, if we glean into the autobiography, we find that actually in the biography, the past is not reproduced as a smooth, continuous narrative, and tradition itself is not transmissible as an uninterrupted heritage. Both are selectively cited in fragments of narrative. And it is this that attracts me to the work of Hannah Arendt, particularly her notion of citable past, which is based on her reading of European Jewish intellectuals for whom all traditions and all cultures and all belongings had become questionable. And of course, the analogy here cannot be stretched too far because of the different political situation of Jewish intellectuals of Walter Benjamin's generation in Europe at the time. But what is interesting is their sort of the marginality of these intellectuals, both in relation to modernity, with its implicit anti-Semitic thrust, as well as to Judaism as their sociological tradition, that this is a sort of instructive, if you will, if not altogether comparable, but at least instructive when one thinks about the belatedness of the South African nationalists to the site, if you will, of problematizing modernity itself. If we see tradition in this sense, the past and tradition in this sense, not as retrievable, not in their fullness, in their full glory, if you will, then we are able to distinguish what I would call Mandela's own view of tradition from two meanings of tradition. I sort of say a little bit about the common sense meaning of tradition as a passively inherited legacy on the one hand, and on the other as a foundational discourse from which characteristics of a person can be explained, can be based, can be sort of foundationally grounded, if you will, on the one hand, and a more anthropological sense of tradition as invented in the present and projected into the past. Both of these senses of tradition are kind of useful and important in reading Nelson Mandela, but I think we need to go beyond them, beyond foundationalism, and also beyond the sense of the implications that people for whom traditions are invented tend to agree with those inventions, tend to affirm them universally and unproblematically. And that is a tendency in the invention of tradition literature that I see problematic. I sympathize with it because with this view of literature, because I see categories like tradition, tribe, and customs as products of historical encounters with others, particularly colonialism. But I critique that implicit, sense of affirmation by everybody, because I will have argued that there was ambivalence as well as negative valorization of tradition in South Africa by the petty bourgeoisie and the African nationalists. Mandela's own relationship with tradition was complicated in that his embrace of it did not amount to a denunciation of modernity, but was in fact an internal critique of modernity itself. So why don't I stop there and open it up and hand it back to you, Stephen.
Thank you, Zolani. There's a lot for us to chew on, and a number of us will have read the paper. So, as usual, please, will you those of you in the room with me here, raise your hand. But you can virtually raise your hand as well on the Zoom if you'd like to ask a question. I'm waiting to see. I know Natasha put some comments in the chat. Is that a dissertation? I think that might be a dissertation with an amusing title. I think while I'm waiting for hands, Nafisa's raised her hand. Okay, I will not be the person to talk first then. Nafisa?
How unusual. Thank you, Zolani. This is it's an incredibly interesting paper, especially in its method, and I think slightly unusual in that way for historians. And the practice of sort of this form of citational methodology that you use is really interesting, because while it looks for kind of utterances that are consistent through a biography, but it doesn't necessarily mean that their content is, and that kind of examination is I think quite revealing, and it's to use a very sort of cliched sense, we have a good idea of sort of invention of tradition in the loosest sense from above, and this is a kind of bottom-up subjectivity approach, as opposed to a kind of bottom-up quotes to support sort of historical arguments that are more generally about the place of tradition and custom in modernity and in modern political formations like nationalism. I suppose what I have is less a question than it is a question, but it's meant to, I think, encourage graduate students who are on this conversation and who I know must be moved by this paper, provoked by it in very interesting ways. And the reason I say that is because I think that your method is potentially incredibly useful, because we have also, I mean, while people have talked about initiation in different ways, you do mention that we don't know a great deal about women in that sense. And right. All of the literature on women and nationalism has come to hinge on one particular aspect, and that is motherhood. And the fights are quite vicious, and they're very clear cleavages between the understandings of the deployment of the term and its relationship to feminism, for example, and feminist nationalism. So what I suppose is that what this allows us to do to some extent is to speculate on what the quote unquote defining custom might be for women in this sense. Before, I suppose, instead of reading motherhood off of it, reading people for their entire biographies for citations of all the aspects of, I suppose, their ideas of womanhood. And so your method offers the opportunity to use this biographical citation consistently and to get at it from the point of individual subjectivity. So what I really want to do is to say thank you for giving us this kind of methodological opening, and I hope that the graduate students who I am thinking of, they know who they are, will hopefully pick up on that strand and ask some more questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. That's very kind.
Zolani, do you want to take that as a comment, or would you like to say more about?
I do. I would. I have to say that one of the things that made me nervous about today was facing historians with a paper that is not true to that discipline in a way, and so some of the things that you're saying are making me think about ways to revise the paper so to those questions indeed, particularly the question of custom and gender, which, as you may see, of course, I lean on the work of Natasha Erlang for that period between 1912 and 1950, and I lean on in terms of the politics of masculinity and gender kind of thinking, the period between 1912 and 1950, and on the work of Alan Cobley on the period between 1924 and 1950, both of them seeing the development of a nationalist discourse that is gendered for Natasha Erlang, and that is a self-consciously petty bourgeoisie for Cobley. And again, it is a big question, a big gap in this paper that it doesn't address the question of womanhood and women, not just as a category in itself, as much as, again, going back to Natasha Erlang's work, as a category that is emergent by the nationalist discourses, and probably feared and stuff like that. So historically, there is some gap here, historiographically speaking.
Thank you, Zolani. Yes, is that, are you done, or did I cut you off?
Yes, I'm done.
Good, okay. I've got Dr. Faiza Balim, who's our head of department, and then I see Revolution and looking for other hands. I'm going to turn the camera, my sophisticated hybrid system here, and see if I can find Faiza. Faiza, are you on the screen? Yes, you are. Oops, there you go.
Hi, Zolani. It's nice to see you. And I really enjoyed your paper. I thought it was very pleasant to read, and making a very interesting argument. My question is something that came to mind while I was reading it, particularly about when you write about how Nelson Mandela spoke quite a lot about his circumcision experience, or his initiation experience. And I was wondering about the fact of each individual's experience of bodily pain and trauma, and how that may have affected the way that they wrote about the initiation in their different biographies. And I was thinking particularly about people who've written about bodies in relation to HIV and AIDS. And I wonder if that is a factor that may have affected this recollection of initiation. And it would also have meant that initiation was different from the wearing of clothing, for example. Yeah. So thank you very much, and I hope that you come back to present at a seminar in our department.
Thank you. Thank you. That's an important question, actually. Particularly the question of body. The body of Nelson Mandela is interesting, and looking at the work of Elega Bima on Mandela's body was interesting to me as I was thinking through this paper. And the other thing that has to do with that is my reading of himself and the body is sheer self-consciousness as a body. And the way in which coming through all of this discourse about initiation and his positive embrace of it is a sense of vulnerability that is not really addressed, rather directly. The other thing is that one struggled very hard to think through the embodiment of trauma that has to do with initiation in post-apartheid South Africa, and the different ways in which Mandela's own traumas sort of are different in a way, but are smoothed over, through discourse. Than the traumas of the 21st century that express themselves in practices of gender violence, of violence against other young men by young men, etc. And so here you have a profusion of a kind of a discursive smoothing over of pain that is not available to a younger generation of initiates.
Very interesting indeed. I see revolution. 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 Are you able to hear?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I find it very interesting that you actually link tradition to basically when you talk about circumcision, how it actually influenced Mandela's life in terms of what kind of leader he became going forward. So actually, how he actually managed to be at the same time to be a nationalist leader and at the same time embracing and also learning from his own traditional ways in terms of carrying on from what he learned from the circumcision schools, how to be a man. Also, not only did he not become a Xhosa man, but it also says here in the readings that in your readings that he became an African man who embraced others without tribalism. So it is very important that you picked on that, because it shows that Mandela was actually not a confused leader. He knew the balance between tradition and his nationalist endeavors and reconciliation, nation building. So I have observed, of course, with sadness when it comes to when I read the biography of Robert Mugabe, that he was a confused leader, because according to the author, she mentions that Mugabe was raised by British, Scottish, what you call it, missionaries who raised him to be a white man, playing cricket and rugby. At the same time, when he grew up, he wanted to be this nationalist leader. At the same time, he was fighting the very same system that raised him. So the very same people who, which is Britain, did not accept him at the end of the day as one of their own, because it was not wide enough. So at the end of the day, Mugabe becomes angry at the British. Hence, if you look at the decisions that he made in terms of land grabs and stuff like that, you can, it shows you that you're talking about a confused leader here who does not know where he stands. But with the Mandela situation, it shows that Mandela was, however, able to differentiate between those two, to actually combine those two, to be a traditional man who knows that he's an African, embrace African traditions, at the same time carrying on with the liberation struggle. And after that, he continued to reconcile the nation and actually prevent the civil war, which almost broke out in this country. So I will stop there. That is all.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that that thought. It is indeed the case that some readings of Nelson Mandela in this regard suggest that he was a well-rounded, kind of comfortable person who embraced the totality of his identities. On the other hand, some people see this as a kind of a contradiction and a source of insecurity on his part, that on the one hand, he clearly says that he admired everything British, the British system, the British parliamentary system, and all that. On the other hand, he sees himself, he situates himself in a critical relation to it, to that tradition as well. So well-roundedness, but also a sense of contradiction there. Thanks.
Natasha?
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Zolani. That's really, really interesting. I have a question to do with how it was that you came to write this paper. So I noticed that you quote Xhosa Manku in what you've written, and I know he's now written a more extensive manuscript on Nelson Mandela. We also have the recent book from Johnny Steinberg looking at the Mandela's marriage.
Right.
There have been a couple of pieces about Willie Mandela recently. But what intrigues me is particularly some of the work that is kind of is why Mandela, why now, I guess, and how would you see yourself as situated against those other writers? Thanks very much.
Thank you. That is a good question. That is a good question. Actually, one of the stimulating things for me was reading your paper on gender and masculinity in nationalist discourse between 1912 and 1950. I read that paper before I read Alan Cobley's Class and Consciousness. And at that time, I was in conversation with Colin Bundy on contributing an article on the publication on reassessing Nelson Mandela, which just recently came up. I was not able to make that that volume. But it was the beginnings of thinking about this paper. And also in conversation with Xhosa Ngwane on his own take on Nelson Mandela. And so it is indeed in conversation with some of the recent and contemporary writings on Nelson Mandela that generated the interest for this particular paper. I think that there is a kind of revisitation of Nelson Mandela because among some people, at least, including Xhosa Ngwane, a dissatisfaction with how he has been historically situated and has historically situated himself. At least the manuscript by Xhosa Ngwane makes an argument that we miss something about Nelson Mandela by not situating him within a pragmatic history of a Tembu royalty with its implications in colonial administration and all of that kind of stuff. But there is a revisitation of Nelson Mandela because I think there is a revisitation of certain kinds of categories, such as traditions, such as tribes, such as custom, for example. And Johnny's work is interesting in that it turns the screw onto what Nafisa sort of reference gender here in talks about customs and tradition. And that's the one work in this recent conversation around Nelson Mandela that's going to have some very interesting take on gender on this question.
Dr. Mogorane, I do have some comments in the chat, and of course I'm looking around the room here too, but Dr. Mogorane, Kamisha?
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me. If so, I'll continue.
Yes.
Thank you very much for this really wonderful paper, very interesting. And I think I'm one of those historians that you were talking about when you were responding to Nafisa's question. because my question really has to do, I suppose, with method. And so living in South Africa today, I have been struck quite recently with just how important the circumcision ritual has become or is amongst highly educated Black professionals. So they spend a lot of money on it. They have very big public rituals, public ceremonies. And so in a sense, it has taken on a significance like a wedding or a baptism of sorts, highly publicized, very expensive, very costly, very public. So that's the first sort of point of entrance. And the second is that the people that you mention, and you're very right, they speak very seldomly about tradition or culture or circumcision. Raymond Mhlaba, Alfred Xuma, Gavin Mbeki. But the interesting thing, of course, is they are themselves circumcised and probably would have circumcised their children, would have supported the same for nephews, for grandchildren, and so on. And so it seems to me that in practice, everyone is doing this, the nationalists or the so-called not nationalists. And so it's a commonsensical everyday practice where people don't necessarily communicate its significance because it's assumed that one does not have to keep talking about what everybody knows is so essential to manhood, in a sense. So I suppose my question is, in terms of the kinds of sources we use to think about quote-unquote tradition, quote-unquote modernity, biography, discourse, life writing, are there some limitations around that? Because these are the kinds of sources where people are talking in ways that have got certain and particular currencies to do with power and politics, trying to mobilize people and so on, as opposed to having other kinds of archives where these practices may seem to blunt the very divisions that we're talking about, for example, versus the traditionalists versus the so-called petty bourgeoisie. So really my question therefore is, how unique is Mandela as somebody who at times makes claim to using a practice everybody else is already in any case using? How unique is he in the embrace of tradition in this sense in comparison to his colleagues?
Great question. Thank you very much, Doctor. Thank you very much. It's a great question, and I think going back to your sense of the limitation to the kinds of sources one uses in order to make this kind of argument, and the exclusion of other kinds of archives in which other kinds of arguments could be mounted on this question. The ubiquity of circumcision in contemporary South Africa, for example, and the ubiquity of circumcision back then, as you point out correctly, that everybody took it for granted. Sisulu himself, in fact, says it is just something that's just important for boys to do, right? So its ubiquity raises the question of how unique is Mandela in embracing it than in relation to his comrades becomes a very important question. And again, informed by a very limited source material here, which is the autobiography, which is life story. One is doing what perhaps a literary scholar would do, which is a close reading of a particular text, which again runs the risk of bracketing off a whole bunch of context, a whole bunch of other kinds of sources by looking closely at a text. That is probably a methodological shortcoming when one looks at this from as a historian, right? But read from another perspective, it is a witness of all kinds of close readings of a text. What makes Mandela unique is precisely that where others have subdued have a subdued kind of discourse on this practice, he doesn't. And that can be explained not just in terms of textual analysis, but also I believe in terms of a different disposition he has towards tradition that other people didn't have, and that may have to do with the fact of being isolated in prison. One is stretching the analogies here perhaps a little too far. But there's something about Nelson Mandela that makes him more comfortable talking about African nationalism at the same time, talking about his circumcision, his customs and traditions that other people are not comfortable doing, particularly people like Govenberg, who actively campaigned, who actively opposed even invocations of ethnic identities in the name of commitment to a nationalist project. So again, to summarize, it is a very limiting and a limited approach that focuses on a life history that engages a close reading of a particular document, and therefore bracketing off a whole bunch of history and a whole bunch of other archives as well. So admittedly, it is limited and limiting.
Something on it. When you finish it,
is that so I know Nafisa's got a question. Kamisha, I think is that your old hand, a legacy hand? And I have a hand here in the room and a couple of comments in the chat. I was just going to say, well, actually, there's a nice link between what Kamisha said and Faiza's question, which is the body itself as an archive of praxis, if you like. But of course, then we can get to all sorts of other questions about consent. I was just going to say before we go to Nafisa and Ruslan and some of the comments in the chat, that I wonder, Zolani, how much of the discourse around circumcision and tradition and some of the taboos within the African National Congress around talking explicitly about this stuff, how analogous it is to the official position around non-racialism and the unofficial transcripts, if you like, if we can call it that, of African nationalism. So there's a sort of official position which insists on non-racialism, as we know, and that is, of course, the source of contestations and political fallouts, etc. And this is another one of those things where there's at least an official position that is non-tribalist, if you like, right? And I wonder if it's useful to think about tradition as occupying a similar kind of, there's a code switching, if you like, that might be happening. That's just a thought. But why don't we go with Ruslan here, and then Nafisa, and then some of the chats and the comments. Ruslan, I'm going to try get you in the picture. There you are.
I have two questions. Is it fair to say that Mandela's other comrades did not mention the significance of experiences of the initiation ritual due to its sacred nature? Because I asked this because I have a Xhosa friend who told me that when he got initiated, it was forbidden for him to speak about such experience with anyone. And if that initiation is sacred, does this mean like Mandela broke Xhosa customs and traditions?
Were you able to hear that, Zolani?
Not really. Can you summarize it for me? I couldn't.
I think it was essentially asking about this. I may have misheard secret or sacred, but both work sacred. That some sacred quality of the initiation rituals is part of the reason maybe there isn't an openness to talking about it. That's the question essentially. Given our time, we'd usually end on the hour. I'm going to bundle that with Nafisa. Do you still want to come back?
I do indeed.
Go. Why don't you go for it?
Okay. Thank you very much, because this is incredibly productive. Ruslan's question, together with Faiz's and Kumish's and sort of my earlier one, makes me think about your answer, Zolani, I think, to Kumishu, Dr. Mukharani. It concedes a little too much. You know, I laud the humility, but as Kumishu knows, I don't labor under any of that. So I'm gonna suggest something bigger, actually. What historian? The other things that historians study all kinds of things. And what this reminded me of, the mention of embodiment and such, is Joanna Bork's work on pain. The kind of post-Elaine Scarry world of understanding pain, because what Joanna Bork says, and the reason I think that this is related to both the sacred and the secret, as well as a number of other things, including, as you say, discourse. She says that, you know, pain is not this kind of independent entity, but is, you know, felt, witnessed, shaped, shared within a social environment, and indeed not shared within a social environment. So she speaks about communities of pain, either uttered or non-uttered. So an implicit idea in sort of masculinity that there is a silent form of pain. I mean, that's of course complicated somehow by rituals that are done, say, under anesthetic in the present versus, you know, different ones in rural initiation schools and in the past. But she uses a very interesting metaphor, if I remember correctly, to talk about how pain and embodiment are not necessarily the same thing. She says she says that claiming that redness is not an intrinsic property of a tomato is important. It's the way in which we perceive a tomato. I think that's a really good kind of analogy, because then pain is a type of event which then gets molded by a social environmental interaction, and it's taken up by language systems. She says it's rendered public then through language, and then of course through politics and through power. And one of the reasons this really I think is promising is because, you know, for women it works. There's a way in which the universality of pain, but the particularity of its expression really can, you know, put men and women sort of together in the story. So, you know, to just give you one example, I know, for example, that the women in my community, the older women, generations older, happen to think that the pain of childbirth is really important to, you know, being a real mother. And the idea that, you know, modern women are having cesarean sections, you know, is viewed as kind of soft and, you know, various other ways of, you know, compromised ideas of womanhood. And while none of these, I'm offering none of these as you know, specific answers, but I do think that that pain in its various forms, and one of the reasons I'll end in a second. One of the reasons is because inside of the nationalist movement, there's a lot of talk of pain. There is, and that talk of pain is about empathy with other people and sympathy with people, and it's used by both men and women. And women talk about pain as mothers viewing something or whatever, and people have latched instead onto like motherhood as opposed to the idea of pain. And I wonder if pain is not perhaps a kind of interesting sort of superseding perhaps political category even here than what you know, we're thinking about. So I thought that Kumish's question was great, but really quite provoking for me. Thank you very much. This is all very interesting.
Thank you so very much. I absolutely appreciate what you, and it please send me a reference on that question of pain and embodiment. I think it's very central, and I think it would enrich me to think more about that in relation to this question. So thank you so much, Nafisa, for that input. Okay, so the earlier question was whether the reason the nationalists are not mentioning their initiation is because it's a secret or sacred, which begs the question why Mandela as a nationalist does in fact mention it so prominently. It is probably the case that the reason they're not talking about it is because it's generally a tabooed subject to talk about in public. But people like Walter Sisulu, who were sat down by two interviewers and asked in detail about his circumcision, was relatively open about it, but sort of poo-pooed the subject on the basis of nationalism rather than on the basis of it being a secret, on the basis of it being a sacred thing. I think they were much more committed to nationalism than they were to the secret of the thing.
So there were a couple of questions in the chat, or comments in the chat, which I'm just going to draw our attention to as we close, Zolani. So Amanda said, my question on the role of Mandela as a custodian of his culture, as a son of a chief, would it have affected him in any way, whoopsie, sorry, if he narrated his experiences in a different way? So I'll leave that to you to think about. This is Jan. I haven't read the whole paper, but for me, 2 points raised themselves. One is, how seriously can one take the autobiography of a politician of a source of what she is really thinking, especially in the case of accomplished performers such as Mandela? He must have realized that he was writing for an audience or many audiences and wanted to keep them on side. Are these really his real ideas? Have they been triangulated in any other texts that he produced on the subject? Yeah. And then secondly, when he refers to tradition, is he just referring to initiation? What does he have to say about tradition more widely, lobola, polygamy, etc., etc.? And Winnie, who was, of course, Winnie, very much her own woman. So yeah, I think those are the questions. Do you want to maybe bring some stuff together there for us, Zolani, and then we can draw to a close?
Right. Mandela's talk on circumcision goes beyond this autobiography into other biographical sketches. It is in fact true that in all of the writings about it, you find it in conversations with myself. You find it in some of the prison writings as well. You find it in some of the letters from prison that he wrote. All of them could be said to have been, as Jan is suggesting here, self-conscious by a politician who knew he was going to be read. But I sort of triangulated those with all of his other writings, as well as reminiscences of his own comrades as well. Hilda Bernstein talks about it at large as well there. He is not limiting himself to initiation. He talks about chieftaincy, for example, as one of the things that are heritages to his tradition as well. And writes about, talks about, arranged marriages as something that is a part of the custom that he was brought up in, but something that he opposes very much. He ran to Johannesburg in defiance of arranged marriage as well. Talks very little about his marriage to his first wife and how that may have been informed by his, what David James Smith called his chauvinism, basically. So again, thank you so much for all your thoughts and for inviting me. And I really appreciate the robust discussion that this paper has generated. And I look forward to taking your feedback into consideration as I revise it for publication.
Thank you, Zolani. This was terrific. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
You take care, everyone. Thank you, Zolani.
All right. Bye-bye.
See you all soon, hopefully in person.
Yes.